The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Okay, welcome everyone. I think, Alvaro, you can get started.
All right. Thank you. So, welcome everyone and good afternoon. Thank you for registering and attending this webinar, which is the virtual launch of the IEA-CSI technology roadmap, which is called the Low Carbon Transition in the Cement Industry. So my name is Alvaro Lorenz. I work in Votorantim Cimentos and Vice Chair, Liaison Delegate of WBCSD-CSI. First of all, I would like to thank the other colleagues who are going to be presenting today. So Cecilia and Araceli from IEA, then Manuela from HeidelbergCement, WBCSD-CSI, and Philippe Fonta, who is the Managing Director of WBCSD-CSI. So as you can see in the slide, the agenda is going to take more or less 1 hour, a little bit more than 1 hour with this opening. Then we're going to explain the roadmap in more details, then discuss a little bit what is going to come in terms of policy, finance, international collaboration. And finally, we are going to close the meeting with a moderated session and Q&A. So next slide, please. Talking a little bit about CSI. So CSI, it's called, it stands for Cement Sustainability Initiative. So it was created back in 1999. So it's already a long time. At that time with 10 companies through the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, WBCSD. So the aim of this initiative was to set a joint collaborative work for sustainable development. And it was created back in 2002, what we called an agenda for action that we set a lot of targets and initiatives. Today, we have 24 major cement producers, and we are headquartered in both developed and emerging countries, and with operations in more than 100 countries. So you can see the spots of the different companies where are their head offices. These companies account for about 1/3 of the world cement production, and ranging from large multinational companies to small local producers. We have what we call communication partners in different parts of the world, amplifying the voice of sustainability around the globe. And it's important to say that CSI, as well as WBCSD, is a CEO-led organization. So next slide, please, about WBCSD. So the World Business Council for Sustainable Development is, as I said, a global CEO-led organization of more than 200 different companies with them to work together in order to accelerate the transition to a sustainable world. And WBCSD also has more than 60 global network partners, so it's a very comprehensive and global organization. And we believe that by close collaboration, we develop better and faster business solutions. So the next one, it's called Turn Challenges into Opportunities. Yes, thank you. So you can see some statements and some additional details. So I would say the global population is expected to grow by 34% by 2050 compared to 2014. So that's a huge number. And in addition to that, urban population will reach 6.5 billion people in 2050, or about 2/3 of the global population. So we are going to have two phenomena. One is the population, the global population increase, and then with the urbanization, we are going to have more people living in urban areas. So that's two important information. This means an increase in demand for cement and concrete. Important to say that concrete is the most consumed manufactured material on the planet. So the global cement production in this period is set to grow by 12% at least from the current level. So we see population increase and the global cement production also increase, for sure less than the global population, but nevertheless it's also growing in terms of volume. Therefore, there is a need for a significant reduction of direct CO2 emissions. CSI members, as we said before, have been working in a collaborative way for several years, taking solid actions to reduce CO2 emissions, even making public commitments to reduce between 20 to 25% by 2030 compared to business as usual. And this, nowadays, we have 18 CSI companies that have, I'd say, public commitments on this matter. So we must recognize that we need to continue this joint effort through a strong collaboration with other stakeholders in order to accelerate this transition. That's a little bit the opening part of this session. So I will now hand over to Cecilia from IEA, who is going to explain a little bit more the details about IEA. Cecilia?
Thank you very much, Alvaro. This is Cecilia from the IEA, and on behalf of the agency, I'd like to welcome everyone to this launch webinar for the Cement Technology Roadmap. The IEA is an autonomous organization that works to ensure reliable, affordable, and clean energy for its 30-member countries. The IEA's first mission was to promote energy security for its member countries, and it was founded after the 1974 oil crisis to help countries coordinate a collective response to major disruptions in oil supply. While energy security continues to be the key aspect of our work, the IEA has evolved significantly since we were created, and is really now at the heart of global energy dialogue and the transition to a clean energy future, thanks to its authoritative statistics, analysis, and policy recommendations. The IEA's mission today has evolved and revolves around three further core priorities, including economic development, environmental awareness, analyzing policy options to offset the impact of energy production and use on the environment, especially for tackling climate change and air pollution. And finally, on engagement worldwide, working closely with our partner countries, especially major emerging economies, to find solutions to shared energy and environmental concerns. The IEA sees itself as the global hub for clean energy, and this map shows you an overview in purple of the IEA member countries who are all part of the OECD, as well as our key partner countries. You can see here, given the shift in energy consumption from IEA member countries to emerging economies, since 2015, through the Association Initiative, the IEA has been strengthening its relationship with key emerging economies, including Brazil, China, Indonesia, and India. Together with IEA member countries, there are 27 non-member countries engaged in our technology collaboration program, and these countries are shown on this map in blue. Our TCPs represent an extensive network of over 6,000 experts worldwide, covering representatives from governments, the private sector, and research centers. With these partners, the IEA is working to support the global clean energy transition as the leading provider of data, analysis, and solutions for the global energy transition, notably through our Clean Energy Transition Program. At the heart of this transition is our work on low-carbon energy technologies. We see that there are positive signs that this transition is coming, with renewables supplying half of global electricity demand in 2016, and improvements in energy intensity, as well as efforts to reform fossil fuel subsidy spreading. Clean energy technologies are progressing, but unfortunately fewer on track. This lack of progress on some puts even more pressure on others, limiting the global temperature rise to 2 degrees Celsius would require an energy transition of exceptional scope, depth, and speed. It is against this backdrop that since 2009, the IEA has produced a range of over 30 global technology roadmaps covering more than 20 of the key technologies for energy sector decarbonization, including for industrial processes. The program has been a considerable success, and it has provided recognized guidance to the public and private sector, in part due to its collaborative nature, evidence based on recommendations on the priorities and steps needed to accelerate technology innovation and deployment, and emphasis on broad stakeholder engagement. In 2016, we started a new cycle of roadmaps that was re-endorsed by the G7 countries that seeks to raise the ambition of the program, showing policymakers, investors, and entrepreneurs who are navigating an increasingly diverse and regionally specific energy landscape, how they can jointly act to transform our global energy system. The IEA's collaboration with the cement industry spans more than a decade, working closely together to identify energy and emission reduction potentials for the sector. We'd like to thank the CSI for their continued collaboration, which has been an invaluable part of our industry analysis. This, with our first global cement roadmap, was also the first joint publication with the CSI and amongst the IEA's very first roadmaps, which were released in 2009. This was followed by our first national cement roadmap with India in 2013, which was developed in collaboration with the CSI's Indian members and included an implementation phase supported by the IFC. And we're also providing input to a second national roadmap for Brazil. And we are pleased to be working again together with the CSI on the latest global cement roadmap. And I'd like to turn over to Araceli to present the details of this report.
Thank you very much, Cecilia. So we just wanted to go into a bit more details about this new edition of the Cement Technology Roadmap. First, to explain what the process implies. Of course, the main objective of the roadmap project is to develop an implementable long-term sustainable vision for the cement sector. And to do that, we follow a process where, first of all, we gather information in terms of the technology performance of possible opportunities to improve the sustainability of cement production by compiling information from technology papers. We've also compiled indicators from different regions when it comes to energy and CO2 emissions performance for cement production, being the Getting the Numbers Right database managed by the Cement Sustainable Initiative, one of the key contributors to this, with data that is externally verified by third parties, but also we've explored data that was provided from different local stakeholders to get a wider coverage from global cement production. All that information was fed into our analytical and modeling tools to develop long-term scenarios that were used to illustrate the level of ambition and efforts that would be required to improve the sustainability of cement production when it comes to CO2 emissions reductions from a least cost perspective. And all that information was then, of course, shared for review through a peer review process through a wide network of stakeholders, including authorities, academia, and industrial associations and partners, to then again enrich further this analysis. So one of these components of the process, as I mentioned, was compiling information regarding technology options. In that respect, we follow a very similar approach as we did for the initial edition of the roadmap in 2009, where the European Cement Research Academy, ECRA, was commissioned by CSI to develop a set of technology papers that are publicly available, exploring different technology opportunities to again improve the energy performance of CO2 emission footprint of cement production. In 2009, 33 individual technology papers were produced, and for this edition, 52 technology papers were developed, and those were published in March 2017, last year. As I've mentioned, those are available on the website that you've got. You see the link here, so they are ready for download. There were, as you can see, an expansion of the, let's say, the spectrum of technologies that were looked at. Some of the main additions and, let's say, expansions from that compared to last edition were, for instance, the refinement of technologies or papers discussing waste heat recovery technologies, also papers discussing pretreatment of fuels, especially alternative fuels, but also energy efficiency and energy management, optimized grinding technologies, and also alternative cement constituents on top of alternative binding materials that are widely discussed in the roadmap as well. And also beyond carbon capture technologies, also the angle of carbon capture and use was discussed and analyzed through these technology papers as well, and then that information was fed into the roadmap analysis. So setting more the context for the cement industry today, just as a starting point, we just wanted to give you, to run you through a few statistics related to the cement industry globally as of 2014. The first chart that you see here is in terms of energy consumption. So the cement industry is the third industrial energy user globally, followed by following iron, steel, and chemicals and petrochemicals, and it's also the second industrial consumer or user of coal as well. So you can see that the sector relies on fossil fuels quite importantly today. In terms of CO2 emissions, more specifically direct CO2 emissions, there is a specific characteristic of the cement production process where we have to distinguish between energy-related CO2 emissions and process CO2 emissions that are basically released throughout the chemical reactions from limestone to clinker in cement kilns. And you can see in this screen where process CO2 emissions represents about 2/3 of the total direct CO2 emissions of the sector. And this is one of the challenges that is also analyzed in the roadmap, how we can overcome that characteristic. The other component we wanted to raise to set the scene was to discuss about the average cement composition, and this is some estimates that we've compiled for 2014. You can see that the main constituent of cement is clinker, which is the main precursor. The juicy in light green represents now or today 65% of the total, let's say, global cement production. And the industry has been exploring possible alternatives to reduce the amount of cement, the amount of clinker going to cement, as clinker is the main contributor to thermal energy use in the manufacturing process, and thus to direct CO2 emissions. So the exploration of these alternative constituents is been basically identifying some industrial byproducts, such as fly ash from coal power plants or blast furnace slag from iron steel production that are contributing to blended cements to reduce the clinker to cement ratio. You can see here in the light purple and yellow those contributions, and this is another challenge that is explored in the technology roadmap, since some of these industrial byproducts are expected to be more limited in the long term in a 2 degrees context, where those activities would be moving away from, let's say, coal power generation or from the widely established blast furnace route for iron steel production to as an effort to also contribute to reduce the CO2 emissions that they are currently generating. So with that setup of the current situation, then we started by exploring what the forward-looking, let's say, cement demand would be. And here you can see the two variants that we've explored from the base year to 2050 in terms of cement production. You can see we've explored a low variability and a high variability case to try to cope with the uncertainty of projecting cement demand in the future. But what we could see is that indeed rising population, but also increasing urbanization patterns are driving upwards the demand of cement to basically deliver infrastructure development and build basically infrastructures that would be providing this well-being and society that would be developing, especially in growing countries. What you can see in the depicted regional breakdown for the low variability case is that as even if we are expecting a slowdown in the activity of the cement sector in China in the long term, as you see in gray at the bottom, still the whole Asia region represents or keeps a quite similar overall level of cement production over time, because this is the slowdown in China is somehow compensated with the stronger growth in India and other Asia Pacific countries, specifically India is the main contributor. But also you can see that there are other growing, important growing regions such as Africa and especially Latin America. So with that context, we've explored what possible strategies could contribute to reduce the CO2 emission footprint of cement manufacturing, and we have grouped those into 4 categories: energy efficiency, switching to alternative fuels that would be less CO2 intensive, reducing clinker to cement ratio, and innovative technologies, including, for instance, carbon capture storage. And those, of course, all those strategies, let's say grouping these 4 parts, are not cannot be analyzed independently. They have interactions among themselves. For instance, the implementation or a higher uptake of alternative fuels would contribute with an upward effect on the energy footprint of cement production on the cement kiln, because typically this type of fuels have a lower calorific content, for instance. So those type of interactions are also explored in the roadmap. To do that, we developed 2 scenarios. One is our reference or baseline scenario, which we've called reference technology scenario, as you can see here in the dotted black line. And this scenario considers energy consumption trends as well as commitments by countries to limit CO2 emissions and improve energy efficiency, including NDC's pledge under the Paris Agreement. And then we've developed a 2 degrees scenario with the ambition of limiting the global average temperature in the long term to 2 degrees. And then explore what the role of strategies within those 4 groups could be from a least cost perspective. And then you can see here that the main contributors in that respect in terms of CO2 reductions are the reduction of clinker to cement ratio and also the uptake of innovative technologies, including carbon capture, as I've mentioned. Cumulatively, the reduction of emissions between these 2 scenarios globally represents about almost 8 gigatons of CO2, which is equivalent to almost 90% of today's direct global industrial CO2 emissions. So it's quite a significant, let's say, transition what we are exploring here. For each of these families, we just wanted to nail a bit more down into the details. So in terms of energy efficiency, what you can see here is the global average of the thermal energy intensity of clinker on the left, and on the right, the global average of electricity intensity of cement. Here you can see that by 2050, the global average is reaching around best practice levels, so best performance levels for state-of-the-art technologies. And this you can see in the base columns in dark green that are shown in the slide. This is achieved through the acceleration and wider deployment of state-of-the-art technologies, as I've mentioned, such as dry kilns with pre-calciners and multi-stage cyclone preheaters, but also other energy efficiency measures, such as increasing burnability of raw materials, for instance. On the electricity side, as well, an uptake and a wider uptake of state-of-the-art grinding technologies, such as high-pressure grinding rolls or vertical roller mills, are strategies that are basically being explored to reach those levels of performance. The other component to highlight here is that, as you can see, we've also explored what the impact of deploying other carbon emission reduction levers would be in terms of energy footprint. So you can see, for instance, in light blue, what the impact is of deploying carbon capture technologies in terms of energy consumption from electricity and thermal energy perspective, but also increased alternative fuels, as I've mentioned in light green before, that would also have an impact in terms of energy, absolute energy terms. And also, for instance, a strategy that is being looked at that will be further explained later on is to support the reduction of the clinker to cement ratio by, let's say, deploying further or integrating further calcined clay within the cement composition through blended cements. And this, of course, has also a thermal penalty that has been taken into account, as you can see here, as well as an electricity penalty as well. The next strategy that we wanted to discuss a bit in more detail is the wider uptake of the role of alternative fuels, namely biomass-related fuels, but also waste, including biogenic and non-biogenic fuels. So here you can see that in the current setup, the cement industry has a fossil fuel share of 94% globally, and this is reduced towards a level of around 70% by 2050 in the 2-degree scenario. So again, thanks to the wider uptake of different types of waste materials, such as discarded tires, waste oils, or other types of industrial wastes, but also biomass waste such as waste wood, sawdust, seaweed sludge, etc. So again, you can see here the uptake on the low and high variability cases in that respect. But we see here that the main differences are more due to regional differences that are explored in the roadmap, you would see in the report, but the global averages remain pretty similar in both low and high variability cases. With that, I'm going to hand the floor to my colleague Manuela Ojan from HeidelbergCement, as she's going to continue the presentation on the technical details of the roadmap. The floor is yours, Manuela.
Yes, thank you, Araceli. I will now move to one of the other levels that were introduced, that is the reduction of clinker cement ratio. This is one of the key levers because it is expected to deliver 37% of the cumulative emission savings in 2050. According to the modeling of the roadmap, the reduction of clinker cement ratio will be from 0.60% ratio in 65%. It was in 2014. It will move to 0.6% in 2050. Indeed, clinker can partially be replaced with other cement constituents, and these are mainly gypsum, natural pozzolana, limestone, and industrial byproducts. Already today, a huge share is represented by industrial byproducts. You can see there in 2014, 13% is blast furnace slag and 6% is fly ashes. But unluckily, these two industrial byproducts are expected to decrease in terms of availability over the years because indeed there will be more and more competition of industrial players. And for example, iron and steel will move towards scrap-based electric arc furnaces, so there will be less slag available, as well as the production of fly ashes from power plants will decrease as far as less coal will be used in the future to produce electricity. Then we see that in 2050, the share of composition of cement will change in favor of more use of limestone. Limestone is already widely used today as a filler, but it will increase its percentage share. And there is also a new entry that is calcined clay. Calcined clay is already used today in a specific location where it is today economically viable, but is expected to be used more and more in combination with limestone in the future. Calcined clay is the result of drying, crushing, and calcination of raw clay. And so its applicability depends on local availability and treatment cost. Indeed, within the technology, ECRA technology papers, all these alternative cement composition materials are explored in depth. And the ECRA technology papers have been the reference technical document for reaching these estimates looking at 2050. In the next slide, we can see more in detail what is available in the technology papers in terms of low carbon solution. So all the materials that can be used for replacing clinker are assessed in detail. And in addition, also high performance cement and concrete are taken into consideration, and which could be their benefits. For example, ultra high performance concrete with reinforced fibers. This could be a new solution having a widespread use in the future. And then for each of these carbon solution within the roadmap, there is a detailed assessment of their impact, the quantity of substitution, the maximum quantity of substitution that is allowed, and which are the influencing parameters. You see here an example specific on calcined clay. As said, due to the drying process of raw clay, the use of calcined clay will require higher thermal energy used per ton of cement, but at the same time there will be a decrease in terms of energy, electric energy used. So overall, the use of calcined clay allows for a decrease of direct CO2 emissions, approximately 73 kilograms of CO2 per ton of cement, and also a decrease of indirect CO2 emissions, 2.5 kilograms of CO2 per ton of cement. In terms of input of calcined clay, the maximum level to guarantee given performance is around 0.35 tons per ton of cement. So, which are the influencing parameters for the use of calcined clay? Is type, availability, quality, and price. In the price, you also have to include the logistic price, the cost for treatment and calcination, and the composition of cement itself. So, one other element related with composition of cement that you will find in the roadmap is a very specific spotlight on alternative binding materials. They indeed offer opportunities for process CO2 emission reduction by using mixes of raw materials and alternatives compared to Portland cement. However, their commercial availability and applicability differs widely, and there is currently no independent publicly available or robust life cycle assessment for comparative quantification of production costs. For this reason, we consider as premature to include them in our technology roadmap in terms of real contribution to the CO2 reduction on the long term. In any case, you can see in this graph which are the materials that have been at least assessed. Some of them are already commercialized, so they are already available on the market. Others are at demonstration phase, others are at R&D level. For each of these materials, consider what has been also put into evidence is the real potential comparative CO2 savings that these materials can provide. As you can see from the graph, there are materials like the so-called MOMs, where MOMs stand for magnesium, stands for magnesium oxide derived from magnesium silicates, and due to the fact that this material absorbs CO2 during curing, it can almost offset completely its CO2 emissions. However, there is a limitation for its deployment that is linked to the fact of the availability of raw materials and operational costs for the treatment and the preparation of material. One other example is alkali activated binders that are better known probably as geopolymers. They are already on the market. They are a broad family of products, but in this case, they have limitation in terms of market applicability and recognitions of these materials by standards and norms. Next slide. In terms of innovative technologies, the technology of carbon capture and storage is one that can give the highest contribution in terms of innovation, and it can even bring 48% of cumulative reduction, moving from the reference technology scenario to the 2 degrees scenario. Indeed, after being generated in the kiln, the CO2 can be captured and purified from kiln flue gas when combustion happens under oxy-fuel conditions. According to IEA modeling, the oxy-fuel technology will be indeed the first one in terms of volume of carbon captures. It will be first then appear in terms of capture volume in 2030, the fuel oxy-fuel, together with the partial oxy-fuel. Indeed, the partial oxy-fuel contribution is smaller because it can only affect the CO2 emission from the combustion process, while the oxy-fuel technology can even tackle 100% of emissions from the kiln. Later on, when the CO2 limitation will become stricter, also more expensive mitigation options will become necessary, and then other technology like the post-combustion will be could be applied more extensively and also bring volumes. You can see from the graphs the volume expected in terms of reductions. Overall, the expectation is that in 2050, between 25 and 29% of CO2 generated from the kilns could be captured. Next slide is about, again, the technology paper. Indeed, technology paper, they go into detail about which are the different technologies that can be used for carbon capture. And for example, they zoom into oxy-fuel technology, since on oxy-fuel technology, there are already some pilot projects now operating. The potential impact of carbon oxy-fuel technology in terms of electric energy use, it will be indeed an increase of electricity consumptions. This is mainly due to the production of oxygen and to the purification of the CO2. But on the other side, due to the fact that oxy-fuel can even capture 100% of CO2 emitted, in terms of direct CO2 emission, there is a decrease up to 835 kilograms of CO2 per ton of clinker. So the overall CO2 emitted from clinker production. And because of electricity energy usage, there is an increase, a light increase in terms of CO2 emissions. The quantity of oxygen that is needed for air separation unit is between 0.25 and 0.3 ton per ton of clinker. Of course, the impacts in terms of CO2 energy and in terms of cost depend on the level of achievable CO2 concentration, the level of retrofitting that can be applied to existing kilns in terms, for example, of air leaks in the kiln, and the energy use of the kiln system itself. In terms of cost, the investment expected to retrofit one plant as to apply oxy-fuel technology is between 100 and 130 million euros. There is also an increase in operational costs, and overall, at the current level of technology available, the cost per ton of CO2 avoided expected is around 45 euro per ton. So next slide. The mitigation levels that we have presented to reach the 2 degrees scenario indeed are only partially under the control of the cement industry. And for example, this is the case of energy efficiency. However, all these reduction levels need to rely on policies, financial instrument, and international collaboration. The timeline that we have presented in the roadmap and the milestone are based on our expectation in terms of how these enabling factors will become real. A strong message from the roadmap is that a move from a purely sectoral approach to a systemic perspective is needed. So stakeholders should support a transition to a low carbon built environment where the construction industry will be asked to deliver solutions for a carbon neutral built environment over the life cycle, the overall life cycle. But the industry will also need to be provided with the necessary enabling conditions. So I now leave the word to Alvaro that will introduce the policy, financial instrument, and international collaboration aspect.
Very good. Very good. Thank you, Manuela. Thank you, Araceli. So, as you saw during the presentation, in order to achieve this 2-degree scenario, we must recognize that will be needed a huge level of investments, as we are going to see. So, to implement this vision, we need to accelerate development and deployment of CO2 emissions reduction levers, as well as supportive policy, public-private collaboration, financing mechanisms, and social acceptance. So it's a very long value chain that is going to be involved in this solution. Therefore, we cannot do it alone. That's a key statement, and acceleration is needed. So we need to establish several actions. You can see some options here. So I'm going to give you some examples. So creating carbon pricing mechanism with a stimulus package. We know that this is going to be very important. We have in some countries emission trading system, other countries we have carbon taxation. So in terms of carbon pricing mechanisms, this is something which is going to be important, plus some stimulus packages to implement these technologies. Also to implement additional technologies to reduce the clinker cement ratio, as we said before, alternative fuels and energy efficiency, but also developing innovative low carbon technologies, including carbon capture, storage, and utilization. Other example is to intensify collaboration to drive implementation of state-of-the-art technologies and share best operating practices. This is very strong between CSI companies, because I'd say this is a common field work where we share what we are going to do in terms of R&D and actions. So that means we are looking for climate change and mitigation altogether. In particular, carbon capture projects are hugely expensive, as we saw, and difficult to put in place without collaboration. Government and industry should work together to accomplish commercial scale demonstration of oxy-fuel carbon capture and gain experience in operating large-scale post-combustion capture in cement plants. Public-private partnerships can help mitigate innovation investment risks. And the last example I would give you is adapting building regulations and specifications aiming carbon neutrality of the built environment over its entire life cycle. So in order to achieve this path going forward, so because we are addressing 2050, changing, I would say, regulation, construction codes in order to give benefits to high-level cement standards in order to use less clinker or to use concrete with high resistance would reduce the amount of clinker. And by doing that, we are going to for sure reduce the level of CO2 emissions. So those are just some examples. For sure, in the full publication, I'm going to see a lot more details. So the next slide, it's a little bit the continuation of what we just said, which are investments that are going to be necessary for doing that. So as it was said by Manuela, so the reference technology scenario, what we call RTS, would require cumulative additional investments between $107 and $127 billion by 2050. So that's the difference between where you see no action and the RTS. So this difference is between 107 and $127 billion. But we need to go further. So we need to address, and that's the roadmap vision, the 2-degree scenario, and the difference between the RTS and the 2DS is an additional between 176 and 244 billion dollars in terms of cumulative investments. So it's a huge amount of money that need to be invested. So in order to accelerate this transition, strong collaboration is needed with all stakeholders. I'm going to give you some examples: mobilization of public-private investments, robust carbon pricing mechanisms, as I said before, funding investment risk initiatives, because Manuela said in a certain way that some technologies are already available, but they are expensive and they are not applied everywhere. So we would need to give some investment risk mechanism in order to test some technologies to see if we could benefit from those CO2 reduction, but also to adopt a whole life cycle approach along the whole construction value chain. So what is important to know, the roadmap that we are presenting is not what we could say a prediction, because it's just not numbers. It's a map of what will need to be done to be in line with the Paris Agreement, which is the 2-degree scenario. So considerable effort will be needed to make it a reality. So I would finish my part with 2 words, which I think it's very clear what we saw during the presentation, is acceleration, because the press for CO2 reduction is coming more and more. And the second word is collaboration. We cannot do it alone. I think the industry role is very important, but as we have created CSI back in 1999, all the action that we have done, so it's going to be very important to address the collaboration part. So I will now hand over to Philippe Fonta, who will moderate the Q&A session. Philippe, thank you.
Thank you very much, Alvaro, and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Philippe Fonta. I'm the Managing Director of CSI, and I'd like first to thank my members and IEA and ECRA for their contribution to this exercise, and last but not least, also my team who participated in this exercise, which I think is a great achievement and a great example of partnership to achieve this result as Alvaro said, indicating what is necessary to meet the Paris Agreement for the cement sector. So we're going to have a series of Q&As, and I would encourage everyone who is on the line to send some questions by the questions box that you have on your computer, because we have already some questions. And the way we're going to do, I'm going to assign a few questions to some of my members or to IEA, and it's likely that we will not have time to answer all the questions, but be sure that the ones we cannot answer, we will provide answer after the call. And in any case, everything is recorded, and we will also answer the questions that have not been answered during this call. So we have a few questions, and the first one, I will, the question, and if you send a question, please identify yourself and indicate who you are. So we have a question from Prodipto Roy, which is a very simple question, and that would be addressed to IEA. Could you please explain again the difference between the high and the low variability case? So maybe Araceli or Cecilia?
Sure. Thanks, Philippe. Yeah, so the first thing to clarify perhaps is that this future demand of cement is estimated from data based on the projections for GDP growth, per capita income, also current cement consumption levels, and regional demand saturation levels, which are derived from historical regional demand intensity curves. So these factors is just to make sure that the methodology is clear. And then, as I've mentioned, we developed these two cement variants, basically to cope with this inherent uncertainty of projecting the future demand levels of cement. The low variability case is considered the future evolution of cement production that is most likely. So we've considered that that case as the reference case, if you want, for the analysis of the roadmap. And then the high variability case is being developed by scaling up the relative variation of cement demand over time in these different regions. And this could be either a relative increase or decrease, because as we saw in the case of China, the reference case already is a decrease in activity in the sector. So the idea again was to start from a basis and then to scale up those variations to give a sensitivity analysis. And you'll see once you download the full report that all the results are provided for both cases.
Thank you very much. The second question, we have a series of questions coming from Dimitri Koufos. So I will take the first one and I will address it probably to Manuela. The question is, why is natural pozzolana reduced in 2050 for clinker substitution?
Yeah, indeed, on this question, the share is 2% both in 2040 and in 2014 and in 2050. So I do not understand the question itself, because looking at the pie chart, the percentage is stable at 2%.
Okay, so
maybe we just sorry,
yeah,
maybe we just go back to slide 17, just to a quick look.
Yeah.
It's 2%, 2%,
can
right?
see the, yeah.
Okay, so the next question is about Belite cement.
Yeah, the next question. The next question from Dimitri. What is the commercial constraint for Belite clinker becoming available?
Okay, the current deployment of Belite cement is today limited and confined to a small number of countries to their property, the specific property of the material that is much lower early strength characteristic. And it is used indeed in massive concrete dams, and it's used since over than 15 years in China. So indeed, it's already been applied, but for specific kind of application.
Okay, so then we have two questions which are more financial related, and I will probably address them to Alvaro unless someone else wants to intervene as well. The first one, still from Dimitri, is there any projection for the capex of oxy-fuel to go down until 2040? So maybe Alvaro or Manuela.
Yeah, thank you, Philippe. Maybe Manuela can complement me. So I would say that as every new technology, so the initial costs are higher because there's a lot of R&D and a lot of equipment that are not, I'd say, commercialized normally. So I'd say there is a huge R&D investment cost that justifies the fact that we are estimating between 105 and 130 million euros of investment for one single unit. So we expect for sure that this cost is going to go down over the years, but the point is we have no provision how much down that could go, because right now, as Manuela said, there are very few pilot plants, I'd say, or pilot trials being done. So we cannot estimate nowadays if this is going to drop by 5% or 25%. The importance is that the use of energy, electric energy, is very high. So there is a limitation of what could be reduced in order to reduce investment costs. Maybe Manuela, if you'd like to complement.
Yeah, no, I think the same. There are a few pilot projects already at industrial scale ongoing in Europe that we are monitoring, and I think that based on the results of these pilot projects, we will have a clear view on how costs can go in the future.
Okay, so we have another question from Dimitri, and this question is, for the financing, what is the role and percentage of climate finance that would be needed by 2040?
So
and
maybe Araceli,
for Alvaro
or Araceli, maybe?
Or Araceli?
Yeah, sorry. So the question, financing, what is the role, percentage of climate finance that would be needed by 2040? I think this is...
2040, yes.
Yeah, I think that's also, again, a bit related between the discussion of private and public collaboration. I think certainly in the discussions and analysis in the roadmap, there is specific sections discussing about how to mobilize funding and also international collaboration. Alvaro has made the point that public-private mechanisms and could stimulate to reduce the risks of investment, such as the demonstration projects that were just discussed in the previous point. And in that respect, beyond this type of mechanism, certainly financing bodies, international organizations, as we saw also in previous roadmap exercise, could be fundamental as well and instrumental to basically support the implementation of some follow-up projects that could be supporting meeting the targets that were identified in the roadmap. Maybe I just take the chance to mention that in this edition of the roadmap, there is a specific emphasis on key actions to 2030, just because in this question it's been mentioned 2040. I think there are several questions related to 2040, which is quite interesting to see. The horizon of the roadmap is 2050, but as I've mentioned, the implementation, let's say, actions were more focusing on the 2030 timeframe to make sure that there was an acceleration of the different research, development, and demonstration needs to make sure that the long-term targets were met. So yeah, I mean, that's something also to have in mind in that respect.
Okay, we will have time to answer the two questions that have been asked and that we have on our screen. But if other people have other questions, don't hesitate to write them, because then we will be able to not to answer them during the call, but at least to keep them and to reply after the call. So the two questions that we have, one is from Michael Inkel, and I will probably address it to Manuela. And the question says, for the lever, alternative fuels and raw materials, did you consider only direct emission reduction or also indirect emission reduction?
Yeah, if I understand well the question, and you are referring to the projection in the roadmap, we are only considering direct emissions, so emissions that are directly responsibility of our industry and linked to our production process. So it's direct emissions.
Great. And the other question comes from Eric Massanet, so I think I'm obliged to address it to IEA, because I guess you know Eric. The question is, it was mentioned that the lack of literature data posed a barrier to evaluating some possible decarbonization options. What would you recommend as high priority research topics for the research community to help IEA and CSI, if I can see the question that arrived, to fill the data gaps moving forward? So how can you help us? What would be the priorities to help us in filling the data gaps for moving forward?
Thanks, Philippe. Yeah, we can take that. So yeah, I mean, one of the main objectives of the roadmap is basically to identify those gaps. So you'll see throughout the report as well, there are specific sections that for each of the carbon emission mitigation levers that we've described, they outline different research and development goals and needs that could be needed to basically support the type of deployment that we are seeing in the 2-degree scenario. I mean, I could just outline a few areas. One of the most, let's say, important ones would be the area of alternative binding materials, as Manuela was describing in the presentation. Some of those families of materials are are not commercially available, are either at pilot phase or research phase. And of course, these areas would be quite important and interesting to further develop to understand what the real potential of such alternative products would be in terms of CO2 emission reductions in comparison with other strategies that we've quantified in the report. The other aspect to mention is that one of the barriers for performing a robust quantitative analysis of the impact of these alternative binding materials in general is the lack of techno-economic information related to the performance and production processes of such materials, as well as long-term durability. So even for this type of alternative binding materials that would be at commercial phase or that are commercially available, that's also the case. It makes it a bit difficult to compare robustly what the optimum, let's say, material could be for a given application because of this lack of information. So beyond pure R&D efforts, there's also an action that we've been highlighting in the roadmap, which is about performing techno-economic studies of such materials that would be comparable. And then, as I've mentioned, especially in the area of innovative technologies, including carbon capture, there's specific targets to gain experience and demonstrate at commercial scale different capture technologies, as Manuela and Alvaro have been describing, but also there are specific aspects highlighted in the roadmap as well about some of the existing technical challenges that would need to be, let's say, overcome for different innovative technologies, or also technology supporting energy efficiency improvements to be basically at the commercial scale. So again, there's quite of a wide list in the roadmap document that can be consulted.
Okay, so thank you very much for these questions, and thank you for the answers. So we have two additional questions that we don't have time to treat during the call, but we will make sure that we will send the answer very soon. And I just say hello to Alan Kreisberg, who has asked one of these questions. Glad to see you there. And also hello to Carlos Medina from CEMEX and Diana Paulina Munera Franco for the questions. We will make sure we will reply to you very soon. As a concluding remark, as you have seen in the presentation and in the slide, you have identified that CSI has been a pioneer in setting up partnerships and in establishing these type of platforms to identify what is at stake and to identify what needs to be done to meet the challenges. We have done the first roadmap, which was the first sectoral roadmap ever in partnership with IEA and also with ECRA in 2009. And we have an update today, and it's very important to identify that, but also to identify that now is probably time for the sector to expand these partnerships towards a whole life cycle approach and throughout the whole construction value chain. So that's something that we have identified. We know what has to be done for the cement manufacturer, and we have identified it again through this roadmap. We know what the gap is, but we also need now to look at the whole value chain. And for that, we have identified 6 types of stakeholders that we have to work together. First of all, it's also the companies of the cement sector who are not part of CSI at the moment, and for which it will be important to bring on board in order to work with them in establishing these reduction solutions, but also to work with the trade and industry association, the regional ones and the global ones, to try and identify how can these technologies be supported by the policymakers, and how we can work with them locally, nationally, and regionally to support the scaling up of these solutions. It's also important to work with other companies of the construction sector who are not cement or concrete producers, and for that we will look Firstly, being in WBCSD with the companies of that kind who are part of WBCSD, but also companies who are outside that. And then we have three types of stakeholders, which are, the ones coming from the policymakers that I mentioned in relation to the trade and industry associations. But it's very important that the standards and the building codes are set up to facilitate the implementation of efficient solutions. It's also the financial community, and I'm glad that some people from the financial community were there during the call. It's important to, as you have seen on the slide presented by Alvaro, that this financial community supports the implementation and the scaling up of the implementation, but also the research. And for that, we need also the policymakers to support the research opportunities. And when I speak about research, I should obviously mention the 6 stakeholder group that we have identified, which are the universities and the research center, for which we need some resources to develop new type of products, new type of solutions that then can be implemented. So that's the type of partnerships that need to be established in the future. And with that, we hope that it will enable to mobilize public-private investment, so that in the same time the government and the public companies will contribute to support sustainable transition of the cement industry, including with public procurement, which is very important. And finally, it is important to leverage that on an international way and to have international cooperation to support the 2-degree scenario vision, because there is not a one-size-fits-all solution, but a series of solutions which globally will make it happen. There are lots of differences by region, whether it is availability of materials or whether it is level of development. So that's why in partnership with IEA again, we have developed some regional roadmaps in India and in Brazil, and that we have been updating this global roadmap. So with all that in mind, and in order to move forward, because it's very important, and I'm very happy that we could achieve this result of having the roadmap being virtually launched today. But a roadmap, if you let the assumptions, or if you let the document on a shelf, it's pretty useless. So now it's very important to implement this roadmap, and for that we are thinking of the next steps, particularly to include the whole construction value chain, and we are thinking about how to shape this new initiative and how to let's say take the leadership in federating the sector. But what we can already tell you is that on June 5th, which is the World Environmental Day, we will organize some events to inform the world and inform of the potential partnerships we have already created, and inform on what would be the next steps for the sector to move towards the whole life cycle approach and involving the whole construction value chain. So this is the next step, and the sector has done a lot in the past, but we are very much looking to the future and looking at solutions to match the challenges, not only the challenges in terms of climate change, but the need to provide a material that will be essential for society and for the urbanization of our society that will happen in the future. So as a conclusion, I would like to thank all the participants to this webinar, obviously my members, the IEA, my team, and all the people who connected, asked questions. And for those who were not given the possibility to get the answers during the call, once again, I remind you that this will be replied to you in a few days by our team, and we will connect to you. So thank you very much, and have all a nice weekend.